Thank you very much for coming. I'm Lee Hamilton. I'm president of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this important conference. Stabilization and Reconstruction Operations in Post-Conflict and Crisis Zones, the Challenges of Military and Civilian Cooperation. The Wilson Center is our nation's memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As many of you know, the only president of the United States to hold a PhD degree. I'm not sure that's a plus or a minus, I don't know. We honor Wilson's memory by bridging the gap between scholarship and policy, bringing together the thinkers and the doers in a robust, serious, and nonpartisan dialogue on the key issues of the day. Today's program was an initiative of our junior staff project, specifically an effort by some of the very talented young people we have here at the center to advance the dialogue on the link between military operations and development assistance in conflict areas. In particular, let me thank the good work done by Christophe Leroy, Alton Bulin, Jessica Virat, Kate Brick, Mike Jobbins, Georgina Petrosky in setting up this conference. Today's event was also coordinated with the Wilson Center's project on leadership and building state capacity. Under the stewardship of Howard Wolpe, this project is doing very important work, particularly in Africa, to develop innovative and effective ways to replace the chaos and conflict with stable governance and responsible leadership. I'm pleased that Howard, I think, will chair the second panel this morning. Civil-military cooperation is one of the most challenging and most essential security and development tasks of the 21st century. Increasingly, the lines between security and civilian operations are blurred. Just look at a few of the prominent conflicts of the last decade and a half: Bosnia, Kosovo, Congo, Haiti, Afghanistan, and of course Iraq. Each of these presented unique difficulties, yet each highlighted the need for effective coordination and cooperation between the military and the civilian sectors. Getting this right demands patience, perseverance, and coordination within and among governments and with non-governmental actors. Tasks as diverse as policing, engineering, medical treatment are urgently called upon and must be coordinated, often over a period of years, in very dangerous places. This overwhelming demand for diverse skills and resources only highlights the need for effective cooperation. In most conflict or crisis areas, security forces are not going to get it done alone, and neither are civilian agencies. Yet too often, coordination, communication, and transition between the military and civilian sectors have been strained. Indeed, from the conflicts of the post-Cold War years, we can draw, I think, several important lessons. There must be a clear chain of command in which the role of the military and the role of the civilian organizations and authorities are clearly defined. There must be effective and continued communication between military and civilian agencies on the ground. There must be clear points for transition from military to civilian operations. Distribution of basic aid, food, water, medicine, must proceed on humanitarian, not political grounds. There must be contingency planning for worst-case scenarios. And, of course, there must be patience. When the inevitable stresses and strains do take place, they must not get in the way of the larger mission of restoring stability and a better life to those who are in harm's way. Ultimately, the welfare of all involved, the security forces, the civilian agencies, and above all the people in post-conflict and crisis zones, is best served by effective cooperation and coordination. Today, in the Wilsonian tradition, you will hear from a wide range of relevant perspectives. The military, international organizations, the NGOs, the media, academia. It's my hope that you will be able to educate and learn from one another, and that this conference will move us a step forward to getting this important task right. Today's conference is being webcast on our website, www.wilsoncenter.org, and I should also mention that one of our panelists, Linda Robinson, will be a guest on Dialogue, the Wilson Center's television and radio program. Now I'd like to turn things over to our first panel, which will be moderated by a person far more expert than I on these matters, Rick Barton, the director of the Post-Conflict Reconstruction Project at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Rick, it's all yours, and I wish you and your colleagues a successful and fruitful dialogue.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Lee. Can you hear us okay? Great. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Lee. It's hard to imagine there's any category that I know anything more than you in, but I appreciate the thought, and I'll certainly cherish that for the rest of the day. As I look through this at this audience, I can see that there's really somebody in every row who could easily be up here as an expert. So my commitment as a moderator is to make sure that we leave you lots of time to ask your succinct questions, make your succinct points, or make some other succinct contribution during the question and answer period, and that's really my job as well for this distinguished panel that we have. I'm actually looking forward to it because as a regular attendee, I get a chance to hear many of the same people oftentimes, and this panel is really offers some fresh voices for me, and so I'm eager to hear what our guests are going to say today. This has been a long-standing subject of debate. I have not felt that we've made anywhere near as much progress on it as we might have hoped in light of the discussions that we've had over the years. So any progress that can be made today, I'd like to thank the junior staff for bringing this issue forward and bringing some fresh voices to it, because it has become a little bit of a dogmatic argument, and there's clearly room for improvement in light of the enormity of the tasks that we face in these post-conflict and stabilization settings. So I think it's going to be quite a great discussion. We've got some wonderful experience from the field. We'll speak in the order that the panel is sitting. Linda Robinson will go first, and rather than give you full biographies, which you really have in front of you, I'd just like to say that she is a senior writer at the U.S. News and World Report and has a new publication, a new book out called Masters of Chaos, The Secret History of the Special Forces, that I'm looking forward to reading, and I'm sure we'll hear something about it during her presentation as well. She was a Nieman Fellow, in addition to many other honors that she's had. Roy Williams is one of my old favorites, a former colleague when he ran the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at AID. I'd like to think of Roy as having probably brought more talented people to the field that we work in than any other person that I know on Earth, especially when he was at the International Rescue Committee, where he recruited some of the most able people that we all had the privilege to work with over the last decade, and that I had the opportunity to try to steal from him on several occasions.
Successfully.
That's the advantage of those NGO salaries. Then Paula Lloyd, who is the civil military officer at the UN mission to Afghanistan, and also has not only a wonderful set of experiences in the field, but was also served in the U.S. Army Reserve and for IOM. So I think we've really got some very talented people. Looking forward to the conversation, and we've got really the full time on our schedule to have each of them make their 10 to 12 minute remarks, and then for your conversation with them. Thanks very much, Linda.
Good morning. It's great to be here. I think I alone among the selected speakers today have to be qualified as an observer and not a practitioner. You're going to have lots of great practitioners giving their points of view. I have, I think, two things to offer to you. I've been a journalist for 20 years, and most of that time have been out watching and analyzing various types of conflicts and wars, crises, and the attempts to manage them or conduct nation-building, low-intensity conflict operations or counterinsurgencies. A lot of that time I spent in Latin America, where there were quite a few conflicts, the Central American wars, Haiti and Colombia, to name some that had extensive U.S. involvement. Also others, including two uprisings in Mexico, various guerrilla conflicts in Peru, and so forth. But I was, I think, invited here primarily to speak about my experience covering the Special Operations Forces, and particularly the Army's Special Forces, which is the subject of the book that I wrote. That book covers a number of their missions over the past 20 years, this sort of post-Vietnam generation of Special Forces soldiers. And just to give you a brief idea of both the book's content as well as other Special Forces missions that I've had some reporting experience on, Desert Storm and Just Cause in Panama, Somalia. This was part of the book reporting, and it wasn't the Somalia of Black Hawk Down, but rather some earlier Special Forces involvement that involved making contact with the various warlord networks around the country, as well as protecting the humanitarian effort in the early phase of that. They were later pulled out, but it provided an opportunity and kind of a model for using the Special Forces early on to try to understand the conflict. And my view of Somalia, which I did not report on extensively, but I believe that it was fundamentally a misdiagnosis of the problem as essentially a humanitarian problem rather than a failed state problem. I've also spent quite a lot of time in Haiti, where the Special Forces were deployed throughout the country. Colombia, quite a lot of time there as their mission shifted from the counter-narcotics training to a more classic counterinsurgency training. The Balkans, the extensive role they played there, both in Bosnia as well as Kosovo, Afghanistan, and in the post 9/11 period, their role in the Philippines, the Horn of Africa countries, and the largest portion of the book is devoted to the missions that they carried out in Iraq in the early phase of the war. I've since been back to Iraq several times, and I will speak about a few of the specific missions that they undertook in Iraq. And finally, and many of you, especially the Africa experts here, will be aware of the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Initiative that they're now involved in, involving a number of countries in Africa. I'd like to also just offer quickly a few observations, general observations, before giving you a couple of specific experiential anecdotes. First of all, going to many conferences around town, it seems stability operations is now expanding to include what I would call traditionally a counterinsurgency or insurgency kind of mission. And I think that it's very important when discussing the roles of both the military and the civilian actors to be very clear about defining what the exact nature of the conflict is, as well as then, of course, this whole basket of humanitarian operations, disaster relief. And I think that while it's laudable that there is a new energy, I think within the U.S. government and within the concerned policy community more broadly, to try to build institutions and practices to deal with this type of conflict, it's very important, I think, not to assume that one size fits all. And that is, in fact, one of my overall points to make, and I think that it's very important that there's a premium on a correct diagnosis of the problem in a given country before launching off and trying to put a template on how it's to be solved or handled. I think that it's very important that those involved in making the policy decisions at this point don't attempt to reinvent the wheel out of whole cloth. There's a lot of valuable experience that can be learned from. I think that the experience of El Salvador is very important and was considered, at least by many of the Special Forces folks who were involved in it, as ultimately a success story, one that took a long time and had a lot of bloodshed involved, but eventually came out as a successful transition from an insurgent environment to a functioning democratic government. I think that one general conclusion I've come to from watching these conflicts is that most solutions are worked out on the ground. The solutions are primarily local, that the actors out there on the ground have an incentive to solve the problem. And oftentimes the bureaucratic conflicts, the turf battles, really gain intensity back at the headquarters. And if there are competent and dedicated individuals out in the field, they usually can join together and find the solution. Normally those are also long-term solutions. They require a commitment. There's a lot of discussion within the U.S. military, of course, about whether general purpose forces are to be dedicated to the stability operations tasks or whether there are special purpose forces, unique units that should be dedicated and trained for this. My view is, when possible, the special purpose forces should be used, and that includes not only the special forces but the FAOs, the foreign area officers, the perhaps some specially trained military police units, engineers, explosive ordnance disposal units. There you could pick out a variety of units that have a particular competence, as well as, of course, the reserves, which possess unique capacities. Finally, I think it's very important to note that probably not all problems can be solved, and I personally would put Haiti and perhaps Somalia in that category. I know that there are people who are going to probably continue for one reason. Haiti, of course, is right off our shores, but when you look very coldly at the problems that Haiti confronts, it's very hard to see that all the goodwill in the world is going to solve those problems. A lot of people, perhaps in the civilian community and particularly in the development community, may not believe that there is a role for special forces in this arena. And I think one reason that viewpoint may exist is not a lot is known about how they are trained and what they're actually designed to do. And partly that's because of popular perceptions, Rambo movies, a lot of Vietnam stereotypes and so forth, but also because the Special Operations Forces do contain two very distinct elements. There is the Delta Force type of Special Ops unit, which is pretty solely designed to be a direct action commando, a kinetic force tool. And then there are the Army Special Forces, which have historically been used to work with indigenous forces. Those can be armed forces, those can be standing military forces, they can be militias that are formed, they can be guerrilla forces, and they have also worked extensively with populations. And they, in fact, have as one of their core missions what they call unconventional warfare, which is setting up guerrilla forces as they did in Afghanistan most recently to help fight against the Taliban. They joined with the Northern Alliance, and that's sort of their classic mission, but they've also worked in what they call foreign internal defense, which is a euphemism, in my view, for counterinsurgency. And often the Special Forces work hand in hand with the civil affairs and the psychological operations troops. I'll be happy to talk more about their specific mission set, but the essential part of their training is to see these conflicts, low-intensity conflicts or insurgencies, as primarily conflicts among the population. And so they see that the non-military tasks are integral to any definition of victory. They do not see it as primarily a military mission with tacking on non-military operations. So I think that's the fundamental mindset that they start out with. They are trained to roll over into stability operations, which is what I saw repeatedly in Iraq. I was with the Special Forces as they moved from southern Iraq into central and eastern Iraq. And they are equipped to do this mission almost uniquely in the U.S. military, because they alone as a unit are required to have the language and cultural training. And finally, they view this kind of rolling over into the policing, reconstruction, governance structures type of tasks as a necessity, because they operate in very small units. They have to use the local forces as a force multiplier. They just don't have, they never operate in sufficient numbers to view themselves as the kind of security force that's going to come in and blanket an area. Just very quickly, this is the kind of function that they played. I'll just name a few towns. Diwania in south central Iraq, where the Special Forces team that went in there, they functioned initially as the law and order, not just the policing function, but also played the mayoral function. They then gathered together the local sheiks and nominated, or had them nominate a temporary mayor. They were putting on the power, doing checkpoint security, medical teams. I also saw them do this in Kut in the early days there, after the initial Marine force had swept through. And the situation there was very complex, because you already had quite a lot of the Badr Corps folks coming in from Iran, which is very close across the border, and they had taken control of the municipality. So there was a lot of negotiating going on, a lot of attempt to find out how much local support the Badr Corps, newly arrived Badr Corps, had among the population. And so they were just very adept and used to operating in these hazy environments. The same thing occurred out west, and one of the incidents recounted in the book was the operation to take control of Arutba, the largest town in the central western desert. And they were very proud, the special forces there, of the fact that they had an interim mayor on April 9th, which was the day that Baghdad fell. They were already well into stability operations. They used their satellite phones to get food ordered in from Jordan, got the markets open, generators in from plants around in outlying areas. They signed capitulation agreements with the generals there, had border guards set up. And many of you may say, well, why such chaos then? This is now one of the epicenters of the insurgency, or whatever word you'd like to call what's going on there. And what happened, of course, was they were then pulled out, rolled over, a conventional unit came in, did not have the same kind of training. Now many more conventional units have been through counterinsurgency type training, but I believe it was the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment that went in there. They didn't have that training, and so they had employed much more of a classic sit on the population, shoot when necessary. And this is one thing, if you read my book, you will find there's very little shooting in it. Their goal is to avoid the kinetic operations whenever possible. And then, of course, there were decrees 1 and 2 in Iraq that then countermanded what these folks had already been doing on the ground, which was using the local forces. It didn't really matter to them if they were Baathists or not. If they signed a capitulation agreement in the case of a uniformed former Hussein regime person, they were perfectly happy to incorporate them and use them, and the same with the civilian administrators. I will stop now and be happy to listen to all your points of view.
Great, thanks, Roy. Just before you open, there are some seats here. If you'd like to sit a little more comfortably, or those of you, just feel free to use this. We'll hold 1 second while you find a seat, if you'd like, especially if you do it quickly. Probably should introduce Howard Wolpe, who's our host, who's here now as well. Thanks, Howard, for this. One more second and we'll be all set.
I'd like to begin by picking up on the first remark made by Linda here. You referred to Somalia as a sort of a misdiagnosed problem, a failed state problem, and not a humanitarian one. I was directing operations at the International Rescue Committee at the time, and we were very much in favor of going into Somalia because we, as an operational relief agency, were convinced that it was in fact a humanitarian problem. Looking back on it, you were right, we were wrong. It was not a humanitarian problem, but I think the reason we interpreted it that way was because we were of a mindset that sort of preconditioned us to think of problems that we saw as primarily humanitarian as opposed to political. And I think that gets me to my point, and it reminds me of something that comes to mind from Gilbert and Sullivan, things are seldom what they seem, skim milk masquerades as cream. For humanitarians, as I said, we define things to suit our ability to respond to them. And I think that pretty much categorizes most organizations within our system, which is, I think, a central reason why there are so many problems with, one, the definition of stability operations, the options as to how to respond to what we see around us. We are locked into our own institutional preconceptions. And that makes, one, the definition of the problem difficult, and two, the path to resolution even more difficult. It's awfully hard to move back from where you start in order to move on to the next step. And from my way of thinking, and I think my colleague on my left is going to speak to that from an operational perspective, when you're on the ground, you have to be there with a set of preconditions. You have to be there with a set of assumptions so that when you wake up in the morning, you don't have to decide where you're starting from every time you wake up. So that automatically, I think, disables you from being intellectually analytical or even in the long term operationally analytical. How do we get away from that? One, I think we get away from it by acknowledging that the problem exists. If we look at where we are today in terms of civil military operations, for example, the military has a structure which, as my colleague on my right has pointed out, has very specific roles and objectives. It is designed to do something. The humanitarian system is also designed to do something. The military has the advantage of having their definitions in terms of objectives. We humanitarians, we're much more moralistic about our objectives, so we're a lot more elusive, a lot more vague as to where we want to come out and in fact, where we started from. But somehow all of that has to come together. That's quite a problem. In order to come together, again, to repeat myself, you have to go back to where you started. If I go back to the Somalia misperception, and I can parallel that to misperceptions we had about Pakistan, Afghanistan when the Soviets were there and so forth, not that any of those misperceptions are incorrect in one sense. They turned out to be objectively incorrect. But I think in terms of where we saw ourselves, they certainly weren't. So how do you deal with that reality, essentially, is the issue as I see it. Forgive me, I'm fighting a bit of a sore throat. How do you deal with that reality? The humanitarian community is now faced with a world, as is the military community, which is seen from the outside in much more holistic terms than we are conditionally used to seeing it. We like to disaggregate information. We like to deal with it from the point of view of our own structures because that's more convenient. The rest of the world now sees things in a much more integrated way because they live in an integrated world. They don't live in a world defined by the way we define things, but they live in a world defined by their own experience. Now, these worlds, if you make the assumption that I'm making, are increasingly merging. Our structures have to keep up with that in order to respond to it. How do we do that? This, to my mind, is the central difficulty that we have to deal with today. The other thing is that if you look at the security questions, which are increasingly affecting NGOs in particular, humanitarian organizations, and the press in general, we tend to think of them as, for example, if you look at security incident reporting, there are X number of incidents affecting non-governmental organizations as opposed to what they were 5 or 6 years ago. And we even look at those statistics in terms of the organizations as opposed to the fact that, well, how do those organizations seem to the people who are actually influencing what happens to those organizations? Do they see them as distinct entities, or do they see them as part of one whole pattern of imposition from the outside into their communities? My own suspicion is, to be perfectly honest, is that we, the West, are increasingly seen as simply intruding where we don't belong, regardless of our motives for doing it. Now, in particular, one can say that, well, some things are clearly definable this way, or some things are clearly definable another way. But in a holistic point of view, from a holistic perspective on this, I think we increasingly are seen as part of a whole cloth. And that makes it very difficult to make distinctions as to why something happens to one group as opposed to the other. So again, we are pushed into the position of having to disaggregate where we are starting from in order to be able to come out to a place which I think is much more manageable in terms of results. How do we do this? No operation, no event begins the day it actually occurs. It all begins with the preparation for it, I think, in our experience. If you take what happened when we went into Afghanistan, there was no question as to the reason for going into Afghanistan. There was no question that what was going to be the outcome of that was something that was supported by the population in general. But at some point, again, is what happened in Somalia, at least as far as the humanitarian community is concerned. Some part of that mission went awry. If we look, for example, at what happened with the development of the PRTs, what happened with the special forces in using civilian clothing, for example, much in opposition to what the NGOs thought they should do. These things, I think, could have been avoided very simply by conversations before the fact. So the notion of preparing for where you're going to end up simply does not occur to us often enough. And the reason it does not occur to us often enough is that really there is no facility to do it, no capacity to do it, no venue at which it can be done. It seems to me that one of the outcomes that we need to sort of strive for is to accomplish a neutral venue, aim for achieving a neutral venue that is predictable, transparent, and available to all. Obviously, there are limitations as to how far that goes, but the notion of having a discussion which somehow transcends institutional limitations or institutional assumptions or necessities, imperatives, however you want to put it, I think is essential to moving beyond the fact that we are locked in step. We are locked in a place where we don't know how to quite respond most effectively to what I think is an essential aspect of what is going to be a recurring situation over the next decade at the very least. The failed state issue that Linda mentioned, we're looking at Somalia again, okay? Afghanistan, we're looking at Afghanistan again. Iraq, we're looking at Iraq, not again, but continuously. There are so many places where we're running into the same issues, and our methodologies, our approaches for dealing with them don't seem significantly to have changed from what they were 3, 4, 5 years ago. Obviously, that's not going to get it, so what do we do next for an encore? Finally, I think that if we go back to our own communities and assure them in some way, and I'm referring now to the community with which I am most familiar, that what is at stake in terms of maintaining the integrity of the community, because I also feel that one of the most important things about the humanitarian community is that regardless of whether you define what they're doing as humanitarian assistance or relief, it is quite clear that from the point of view of the beneficiaries, from the point of view of the recipients, something very special is being given to them by these people who present themselves as humanitarians. Now, it is more than just providing, a bed for the night. It is much more than that. It is something which has a moral quality to it. It is something which has an emotional quality to it. And that somehow has to be essentially sustained. Working with other communities, the military community, the corporate community, whatever, the political community, doesn't necessarily threaten that. there is, or there seems to be, an assumption that these things, are threatened by working with these other communities. That is not necessarily the case at all. It might require redefinition of some of the assumptions and some of the preconditions that we operate in terms of, but that doesn't necessarily mean that means destroying the fabric of the humanitarian community, as I'm afraid some of my colleagues seem to think. It's not either or. We have our neutrality, we have our impartiality, we have our independence to varying degrees depending upon how you choose to define those terms or apply those terms, but none of those terms are necessarily compromised out of existence simply by working in terms of a much more holistic interpretation of what reality is or is not. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roy. That was, as always, excellent. Paula?
Thank you very much. I'd just like to build on that by going back to the introduction where the word dogmatic came up. I think one thing that we find in Afghanistan, pretty much people on both sides of the debate, whether it's the national military forces, international military forces, UN, NGOs, and the humanitarian community, we've moved beyond dogmatic. We have realized that we have to cooperate. Now that definitely varies depending on, there's a spectrum of cooperation ranging from certain NGOs that want very little cooperation, at least direct cooperation, to other NGOs that are willing to be employed by PRTs, to UNAMA, who works as a neutral ground to bring the two together. But we realize that if we want Afghanistan to succeed, we have got to move beyond doctrinal debates that really don't have much grounding in reality. Could be a lot of reasons for this. It could be because Afghanistan is one of the most insecure places that the humanitarian community is working currently. It could be because people are dying on all sides. So maybe in some ways that brings us all together. I think what you said is very accurate, that there wasn't enough time to debate things before we got into this situation. For example, PRTs. That was debated after the fact. You had a lot of contentious debate, especially a couple years ago, between the humanitarian community and international military forces about PRTs, whether they should exist, what their utility would be. That debate, I think, has been productive. I think it's now moved to a point where PRTs are an accepted part of the landscape in Afghanistan. And people find ways to have a much more constructive dialogue, which I think is very useful. Just to give you a little bit of information about UNAMA, UNAMA is a political mission. Therefore, we have a mandate to work with international military forces, both at the strategic and the tactical level. I just want to give you some examples of some of the things that we are doing. For example, I think that there's something called the Provincial Stabilization Assessment. That's where the Afghan Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, Security Directorate, the U.S. Ambassador, General Eichenberger is deputy, who's in charge of coalition forces, and deputy representative of UNAMA, or the senior representative, will get together with a governor of an insecure province and discuss how can we all use our resources to help stabilize that particular province. What political and reconstruction efforts can be brought to bear. So how can we create synergies so that we don't lose these provinces? I think that another area where there's a lot of common ground is the issue of Pakistan. Unless the political and military solution is coordinated to address the destabilizing influence of Pakistan and Afghanistan, it doesn't matter what else we do in Afghanistan, because we're never gonna to make it a viable state. So that's sort of a strategic level. At the tactical level, you have UNAMA field offices that work very closely with PRTs, for example, trying to enhance good governance, capacity building, things like that. But I do want to point out that PRTs are not a substitute for an infantry battalion. And I think it's important to realize that when we talk about what's called the battle space, there are a lot of different military forces that are operating, and this leads me into some challenges that I want to address. You have PRTs, you have infantry maneuver battalions, you have special forces units, you have ETTs, that's embedded technical trainers for the ANA, the Afghan National Army, and I'm just talking about U.S. troops right now. So in order to coordinate with all of those different groups, it's quite a challenge, especially because within the military forces, they don't always agree. So when you're trying to work together for addressing a problem, you have to take into account internal power struggles within the military forces that you're working with, and then sometimes a lack of communication that accompanies it. Some of the other issues that we face are time frames. Every rotation that comes in has to show that they've done something. So they want to put their stamp on something. Sometimes that can be counterproductive to working with the local government, to working with the national government. They want to put, and I'm talking now with NATO, not just the U.S., they want to put their flag on a project. That's one issue. Also, the lack of institutional memory is a serious problem. We can find that we can work very well with one PRT, for example. When they change out, usually what happens is that the handover or the institutional memory that is imparted is mainly on tactical issues, vehicle security, things like this. But it's usually not on what they've learned as far as interacting with the local government, what have they learned as far as development issues, about working with the NGO community, about working with the United Nations. So we are constantly having to provide them not only with data that we've given multiple times, but also with a situational awareness. One of the things that we find, again, because of this institutional memory, is that military forces don't always have a good understanding of the tribal politics of the area in which they work, and sometimes they can inadvertently worsen the situation by supporting one tribe or group versus another. So one thing that we try to do is we try to explain the situation to them and work with them so that we can avoid some of these pitfalls. Sometimes they listen to us, sometimes they don't. Sometimes their short-term objectives mean that they're not really interested in this. For example, I've worked when I was in Zabul with USAID at a PRT. I worked with 2 different special forces units. I found that one was excellent, one was not so excellent. One of the reasons that the group that was not so excellent had some problems is because all of their interpreters were from one tribe. That means that all of their information came from that one tribe. So we started having problems of certain people getting arrested that maybe were for more tribal reasons than because they were with Taliban or Al-Qaeda. So I just think that that's something that we have to be aware of. The other thing is that we try to work a lot with the PRTs especially, but also with the infantry battalions, the ETT, to report their projects to the provincial government, to report it to the central government, to work with the government in a substantive way, because we're all here to build the capacity of the government. Right now we have the ANDS, the Afghan National Development Strategy, and that's really been a good unifying force for something that we can all get behind and really use it as a roadmap for developing Afghanistan. So that's been really encouraging. Again, another challenge is in extremist support. Planning, expectations, and capabilities. In light of the recent riots in Kabul, this was obviously an issue. But what we found is that all military forces are very willing to engage with us to try to improve the plans for in-extremist support. Now, the opportunities we have to deal with some of these challenges are, for example, training. UNAMA has put on introductory PRT training in Kabul. The U.S. has also done it here in D.C. I think that those are excellent steps toward moving toward PRT coherence to avoid personality-driven relationships. NATO ISAF is also working on a handbook that we're heavily involved with to create some standard operating procedures for PRTs interacting with the government and with the international community. You also see partnerships on projects, especially the U.S. military brings a lot of funds. UNAMA can provide development experts, link them with people in the community that can help make those projects a success. Again, the logistical abilities, especially of the U.S. military in a disaster situation, are unparalleled. This is another way that we've worked very well with the military when we've had, especially in the winter of '05 when we had humanitarian disasters. We were able to work with the military to really save a lot of lives. That was important. One thing that we are also working on, going back to coherence, is an issue that's it's really, really important. It's the fact that there's a lot of national caveats. There's a lot of differences between nations and what their militaries can provide. So again, I talked to you a little bit earlier about the differences within the U.S. military. Now you need to multiply that to talk about dealing with different nations within NATO. So you can, right now, NGOs or the UN, when we want to work with a PRT, we don't always know what their stance is on the military doing development. What is the stance of the donor agency embedded in the PRT? What is their policy for in extremis support? So we need some coherence to improve our capability to do effective civil-military interactions. But I think that it's also important that all of these disparate military elements need to focus on what their comparative advantage is, and that's security sector reform, stabilizing the areas so the UN and NGOs can work in these areas. If you're going to do a project, it has to be linked to a larger security goal. It's not very effective to just build an isolated, uncoordinated project that has nothing to do with a longer-term government plan or a stabilization effort just so that you can put your flag on the project and say you've done something. Because at the end of the day, those dollars were really just wasted if it's not part of a larger project. So I would just like to make one more comment and then I'll stop there. The PRTs, I think, have been especially effective in insecure areas where NGOs and even the UN can't get to in large part. And I think that we really need to look at, maybe one of the places that the military is most effective is in these insecure areas. And I think that's it's been probably one of their biggest strengths. So, thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Paula. I think all three speakers have really put forward an excellent pragmatic view of the enormity of the challenge and how we have to probably use all the bits and pieces that we have available to address them. I think they've also shown the sensitivity, real sensitivity to the strengths and weaknesses of both the military and the civilian sides, and then brought forward many of the bureaucratic and organizational traditions that perhaps are obstacles to that more pragmatic view being as successful as it might be. So they've opened the door to a good discussion, and now it's your turn to bring your comments forward. If I could ask you to try to make your comments within a minute, and I'm going to ask the questioners to give their responses within 2 minutes, and then that way, if more than one wants to respond to a question, we'll have time for quite a lot of discussion here. So please step forward. Well, we start here, and then we'll go to the back, and then we'll go to that gentleman third. So if you want to just sort of line up the second person, we can get going. Please identify yourself and where you're from, if you would.
Hi, my name is Rajai Haki. I'm with the Education for Peace in Iraq Center. I'm also a former Iraq war vet, so I had a little bit of experience in the region. Ms. Lloyd, you mentioned that PRTs are not a substitute for infantry battalions. Is there a need, do you think, do you feel that infantry battalions have a role of exacerbating at times the conflict within indigenous regions, or?
Pretty much, this is not news to anyone, but in Afghanistan there's still a war going on. PRTs are made for stability ops. We need someone that still has combat ops abilities. We need air assets. We need fighting to be done. So when the PRT can work in coordination with an infantry unit to stabilize an area, I think it's really useful. Now, yes, when the infantry battalion, if they're going out and doing projects, because they also have CERP money, and they do this in a way that doesn't involve the government, or they work through a corrupt government official, then it does exacerbate the situation.
To the gentleman in the very back there, can we get a standing up? Yes, thanks.
Frank Kennefick, Chemonics International. We operate in Afghanistan and a number of other countries are in fragile situation. Ms. Robinson talked about chaos and masters of chaos, and I think Ms. Lloyd talked about continuing chaos in Afghanistan. And the good Dr. Williams is pondering, how do we get out of this chaos? I would like to ask the panelists to focus on the fact that many of us believe our objectives are wrong, our instruments are wrong, and absolutely there's no coordination. And I'd appreciate the panel's comments on that.
Thank you for your challenging and succinct question.
Can I start out? I really wouldn't say it's that bad. I think that we're doing a lot of positive things. I think that there is a lot of good coordination. So I wouldn't put such a negative view on things there.
Okay, so that's the good news now.
Right. Well, I first want to say that many people have looked at the title of my book and said, Masters of Chaos must mean people who create chaos. But the Special Forces commander who used that was telling his troops as they went from Afghanistan and were redeployed into Iraq that he expected them to create order out of chaos as they had in Afghanistan. But I think that you make an important point that well, I have 2 points to make. One is I just think it's critical, and this community is grappling with the fact that you really need to build civilian capacity, especially within the U.S. government. There's just a crying lack of capacity, and part of it was dismantled, previously existed in the case of AID, which is just a shadow of its former self. And there is a need for coordinating processes, this difficult issue of how autonomous certain NGOs need to be versus coordinating to get the most effective work together. But I think there's also a deeper level, which is there's a conundrum here that we have faced again and again in Iraq, where a lot of people think you can't do anything until you have sufficient security, and that therefore it needs to be primarily military, primarily combat, etc. Whereas the insight that I think people who've worked with these kinds of situations, they realize security comes from the building effort. Security comes from the governance creating a more competent government. And that is where I think what I hear many in the U.S. military saying, we need more non-military help to actually get a better security climate. And I think that is a tough thing because, of course, you can't expose civilian workers, and they have a hard time getting people to go out into these very dangerous situations, but that is what you need. So I think a lot of people are wrestling with how you crack that nut.
Well, I think that's a very important question, and I'll try to make my response not too abstract because I tend to do that. But I really believe in something called terrible honesty. And we hide behind who we are, our education systems, our structures, as I indicated before, far too successfully to deal with the problem that you're addressing, and I think it is, in fact, an acute problem. We have to be able to move radically away from that. Now, if that means, for example, you referred to AID, my old organization, if that means changing dramatically the way AID functions, changing dramatically the way State Department functions and integrating them into whatever, these are just abstractions thrown out, I think we have to deal with it because the world is compressing very, very rapidly on so many levels, and the dynamic structure which has enabled us to function as a democracy, as societies, as industrial societies for generations, is really no longer able to keep up with the dynamic of change. We have to move away from that as quickly as possible, and I trust that's not too abstract, but it begins with acknowledging that we don't have the answers within our own systems.
I would like to say one more thing. I'd like to give you just an anecdote from the field of how people have work together, specifically with Chemonics. When 7 of your workers were killed last year, 4 in Helmand and the rest in Zabul, when I was there, the UN worked to provide information. I worked to coordinate with the families, and the military worked to put the bodies in a morgue and provide them safe transport out in coordination with the national police forces. So I think that, again, what I'm trying to say is that in Afghanistan, we are breaking new ground in coordination and working together, because in some ways we just have to. We don't have any other options.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little something to that. I think, Frank, your question is really an excellent one. When we started doing this work at OTI back in the mid-1990s, there was, about that time, Fortune magazine featured as its new leadership model, management by chaos. And so I remember ripping out the story and sending it to all of our people, and it was really quite a encouraging thought as to how we might go at this work, because it was current, and you could get great creativity out of it and whatever. But the rules have just changed so dramatically, and the chaos that we're accepting now versus the chaos we were talking about in the mid-1990s is not at all the same. In the 1990s, about 185 humanitarians were killed globally in the entire decade, and it was seen as a bloody and disastrous decade for the protection of our civilians in the field. We've lost over 500 civilians on the Reconstruction side in Iraq alone in the last few years. So it's and nobody's really taken on the rule of how we should deal with this. How should we look at it? Are civilians expected to be in at this kind of risk? And I don't personally feel that fatalities among civilians is really part of the work assignment. And so we really haven't made that choice, and we've left it out there. And there are a lot of other changes in the environment as well as trying to do this work in a war setting. And I think it does come back to something Roy was suggesting, that these situations are still being dealt with as if they're exceptions. Even though the last 10 or 12 years they've dominated our national security environment, and they really dominated most of our organizations, we're still treating these things as if they're $300 billion kind of distractions. And it's pretty phenomenal that if we go in with that approach, we're going to miss a fair number of big issues such as these that we're talking about right now. And until we say it really seems to be the central business of our national security apparatus, and it does seem to be the most important thing that maybe our development community needs to get to, then we're not likely to resolve a lot of these nagging problems. So it's a tougher environment. I think we have a gentleman here. We'll get to you next, and then who else? Then we'll go to the back corner.
Thank you. I'm Chip Walker from USAID. All three of the panelists, to one degree or another, mentioned the importance of good assessment or good diagnostics of the situation to make sure that you're in fact pursuing the right course of action. And I say that and at the same time recognize that lots of organizations, both non-governmental, governmental, academics, have put an awful lot of energy over the last several years in terms of developing assessment tools to be able to understand situations, conflict dynamics on the ground. And yet it seems to me from your comments that those are not really being used. And I guess my question is that in fact a fair statement? And if not, what is it about them that is making them difficult to be applied? I mean, it seems to me if we're constantly having to retrain PRTs, if people don't even understand the simple thing about who your translators are and the fact that they're going to filter knowledge, it suggests we have a major task ahead of us. And I just wonder why it is that there's such a disconnect between what seems to be the rather robust development of tools and their lack of application.
Well, stepping back into my operational role, one of the problems with tools, as it is with lessons learned, is turnover of personnel and transmission of information. You can have the best assessment in the world, and you can pass it on to the person in the field, but then that field operations chief is replaced by someone else, and they're going to pick up the project exactly where it was when they walked through the door. But then that doesn't necessarily reflect the outcome of the initial assessment. It might just reflect the convenience of the situation, the use of translators, for example. But he wouldn't necessarily, or she wouldn't necessarily know that. So there's a process There's no real way of ensuring that where you began is where you're going to end up. The other thing, lessons learned, for example. I remember when going into OFDA, where we were looking, as Garvelinck will remember, tons and tons of lessons learned, and I began to realize that I was looking at the same information over and over again, essentially. Why? Because the systems for passing on those lessons learned were not integrated within the operational design. I also had the problem of turnover. People were being replaced, and they didn't necessarily read all the lessons learned previously, even though they're on the shelf.
So I have a couple of quick comments. I think that at one level, there is the problem that you have identified and we're talking about is at a tactical level, but there's also the diagnosis at the very top leadership level, at the policy-making level. And I think that in the case of Iraq, in my opinion, there has been a tendency there to continue to focus on the combat operations and not really to do the diagnosis of the requirements for stability and counterinsurgency. So that's my judgment. And I think that and I've observed quite a few special forces teams at this point. By no means are they of even quality. And I just want to throw out one trend line. One of their hallmarks, of course, is their great experience. And if you have a team that has been deployed for a number of years in that region or in that country or in that sub-region of that country, they become very familiar. And that's really where their power comes from, is that cultural knowledge and what they bring to bear. And those late 30s and 40-year-old team members who just have that storehouse. And one thing that people will be watching very closely now that they have embarked on an aggressive expansion plan is not to lose that and have progressively younger teams being deployed where you don't have that. And I think one of the goals is to limit the number of new and younger members you put on a team. The teams are 12 soldiers. And what I've seen, the view of most ground level Special Forces soldiers is they really don't want more than a couple of new members per team, or you start really degrading their ability to handle the situation.
I'll just say quickly, I think that things have improved. If you look at PRTs, what PRTs are doing now versus what they were doing when they were first stood up, there's been a steep learning curve. They are much better at doing reconstruction and development activities, of coordinating with the humanitarian community. And I think that in some ways that's very obvious if you hold them up as a mirror to some of the other units, like I've said before, the embedded trainers with the ANA, the infantry battalions that haven't had this focused kind of training. One of my jobs is that I handle complaints from civilians, either Afghans or from the international community, about the international military forces. Almost all of those complaints are about other forces besides the PRTs. The PRTs are doing a lot of things right, but not all of the others are. I'd just like to make a quick comment about the Special Forces. I think one of the problems that you see, at least I've seen with Special Forces in Afghanistan, is because of they're stretched so thin. You had people from 7th Group, which are usually supposed to be in Latin America, over in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they don't have that long-term institutional memory of an understanding of the region.
Really, really excellent points. Yes, sir. There's a microphone. If you just grab it, please.
Thank you. I'm Henry Ryan from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown. My question...
Could you put it a little closer to your mouth? Because I think
sorry.
there are people
okay, how's that?
Out on the internet that want to hear you.
That the PRTs in Iraq, the Pentagon has just reluctantly agreed, as I understand it, to provide security for them. There still is a lot of question and feeling, as I also understand that a lot of that, however, may fall to contractors who also do a lot of other security jobs in Iraq. My question is, how do they fit in the equation? You talk about the sensitivity, particularly of different kinds of military units. How do contractors fit into that equation, who are playing, as I understand, an enormous role? Thanks very much.
Well, that's actually a very, very good question, because you're right. That's another very large component that we can't ignore. A lot of my complaints also come about contractors. Sometimes there are certain contractors that are providing security for different projects who are rearming previously disarmed militias. There are contractors who have terrible reputations for driving worse than the military forces. So I think that if we also don't address the issue of contractors and what they're doing and hold them accountable for some of their actions, then again, it's not going to help us win the war, at least in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think that's an issue that falls within this category of issues that we've just pushed down the road. I think almost everybody who works in these places believes that you have to have unity of command, you have to have monopoly of force. These are elements of the legitimacy of the state, and yet we look at the mix that we have encouraged in some of these places, and it gets way beyond the moral question of whether you want to have mercenaries doing your work for you. If the mercenaries are in the hire of the government and it's clear that they are the only force the government has, then the moral argument may be lesser. But what we've left it out there is with people who threaten our own soldiers because we don't know what they're doing. And I don't think that debate has taken place in the public space at all. It's a huge discussion. And if you look at the total of the forces in a place like Iraq, and we think that we train all the Iraqis that we're planning on training, the numbers are nowhere near the total that we have of our forces plus all the private forces that are employed and whatever else. And yet somehow that mathematics is going to be a replacement. It's very hard to imagine how that's coming together.
So very quickly on that further, I guess I'm repeating what you're saying in another way, Rick. Again, if you make the assumption that I do, that all of this is knitted together. Contractors are a part of the society. Engineering firms are part of the society. Everyone is part of the society, and the problems all are bound together, yet we're dealing with them in such a fragmented way that we're not really coming close to arriving at a solution.
Yeah. If I could just quickly hop in here, I think that the outcome decision-wise has been that the military will provide, after a long wrangle, will provide security for the PRTs in Iraq, but they're caveating it in a way of saying, but it must be they must be set up near a U.S. military base, because what you have going on, of course, is this process of consolidation where the U.S. military is trying to consolidate into fewer and fewer bases, which I think is a controversial decision in and of itself if you still haven't accomplished the security objective. But I agree with everyone who's commented that this is a huge problem. The military does want to control everything that moves on the battlefield, but it doesn't have the mechanism. These people are not subjected to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and yet they are the second largest armed force on the battlefield in Iraq, far larger than any coalition government. So it's a huge unaddressed problem.
I think we're in the back now. Who's next? We have a question from off outside this room. Okay, I'll do that one and then go to you next.
Yes, my name is Pete Kambano from the American Friends Service Committee. Talking about the current crisis in Africa, in the Congo, given the lesson learned in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan, what is your assessment of that conflict? And what can the U.S. do if they decide to get involved in the conflict to bring about political, military, and humanitarian stability?
Whoa.
Try that bad throat of yours, Roy.
Yeah, well, I can't hide behind it this time. Well, the first part of the question is a lot easier than the last part, obviously. The situation in the Congo, from my own experience there, I don't quite see it as analogous to the Somalia for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure you're more familiar with than I. I mean, you have the factions fighting, you have the history of, which goes back decades and so forth, and you have the present situation about focusing upon resources, and that doesn't simply go away. As to the role of the African states in the region, that seems ambivalent. They're not quite sure that they have the military or logistical power, or quite honestly, the willingness to go in and make decisive change. All of this presented the way I'm presenting it, sir, simply presents a tapestry of a situation which is imploding upon itself because no one is willing to either take charge. The UN doesn't have the peacekeeping capacity to really maintain its force in the Congo unless it's vastly expanded, which, frankly, to get back to the second part of the question, seems to me the only solution that's going to lead the Congo into any possibility of change. A U.S. role in the Congo I simply cannot envision, quite honestly, apart from whatever support they might give to the UN forces, which, as I said earlier, have to be vastly expanded given that region and given the fact that you have, 6, 7 different factions now competing within the same geographical area. Not a very positive answer. Sorry.
And a question that was from the outside room. In a sense, this is for Roy Williams. In a sense, NGO interaction with the PRT makes an NGO more insecure. More project resources are needed for security, up to 30 to 40%, and it compromises NGO neutrality. Would you please comment?
My comment, okay, let me start with the end part. The word neutrality. I would have to say that at this point in my professional career, after some 30 years in the NGO community, I am less accepting of the use of the term neutrality than I was more recently. Now, obviously, an NGO has to be neutral in a lot of, to the extent possible. But in real terms, I think it's almost impossible to be totally neutral in any environment in which you work, because inevitably you're going to align yourself with your constituents. You're going to align yourself with, those who work with you. You make your alliances, and there's no question about it. So let's be realistic about that. Now, you have to appear neutral, not only for reasons of security, but for reasons of recruiting, reasons of fundraising, and so forth. But to assume that you are inherently neutral, I think, is a self-imposed illusion. It's an illusion which I will try to maintain, but I understand that it is still, in part, an illusion. As far as the figure, 30%, was that the number?
30 to 40%.
30 or 40%. I'm not quite sure what that is based on, essentially, and maybe you have more information on that than I do. But going back to the origin of the role of the PRTs, initially when they first were inaugurated, and they were initially to extend the writ of the Afghan government. And Akbar, the agency coordinating body for Afghan relief, as you know, was much opposed to them, but not so much on the basis of resource allocation, but more on the basis of that they were taking over the role of the NGO community. Now, put that way, it came across very much as if it was a matter of invidious comparison. They're taking over our jobs. That wasn't a resource issue at all. So, again, getting back to 30 or 40%, I would ask the questioner, what numbers exactly are you talking about, and what do these numbers reflect? Are you saying that it costs 30 or 40% more for a military person to do the same job? That may or not be the case, but then my response to that is that it comes out of totally different budgets, and money is not fungible. So I would throw that back at the questioner. What does that number represent?
You've complicated my job. The questioner's outside of the room. I'll have to wait for the bulletin to come back. Yeah, I think yeah.
Could I make a comment?
We'll see. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd just like to point out a couple things. I think it's important when we're talking about NGOs to realize that there are, at least in Afghanistan, international NGOs and national NGOs. And one thing that Akbar does say now is that they represent all of their constituents. There are some national NGOs that are very happy to work for PRTs because they're looking for funding sources. And so they are more than happy to take a contract directly with the military, especially the U.S. military, because they have so much money. On the flip side of that, when you're talking about, for example, I can give you an example of a USAID implementing partner who was building a school. The USAID rep at the PRT had to go look at the school to monitor it. She said, please don't come with the military. It's going to cause me problems. The aid rep didn't have a choice. They had to go with the military. Happened to be a U.S. PRT. They came in with Humvees. They blocked off the streets. They engendered some ill will among the community. Then after that, the implementing partner started getting death threats, and they had to slow down their work as a result of it. So I think it's just important to realize that there's a lot of different opinions about this. I can tell you that some people within, I've heard on the military side of the PRTs would say that they can actually do the work for cheaper because they don't have the overhead and the contracting costs that others do. I'm not saying this is true or not, but it is an opinion that's out there.
You had a question over here.
Dana Eyre from USIP. I just wanted to make an observation and get the panel to react to it. I think it's really interesting that we've got a discussion of special forces as part of this panel, because if you look at the history of special forces, it really was created in part to marginalize a problem. In the 50s and 60s, that it was to isolate a particular set of problems so the big army didn't have to deal with it. And I think Mr. Williams' comments about the need for all of us to confront the fundamental nature of the problem we're facing is really interesting, because what I see in many of our organizations is this tendency, again, to marginalize the problem we're grappling with. AID creates CMM, Conflict Management and Mitigation, creates Office of Military Affairs. It says, oh, these are special things that somebody else is going to take care of. State Department, we've got state CRS, which again is this kind of marginalization. So I think the challenge, it strikes me, is how do we take the mindset that Special Forces has embodied, but address Mr. Williams's comments of saying, look, we have to permeate this throughout all of our organizations, because Ms. Lloyd's comments about Afghanistan are, look, this isn't a special thing. This is everybody having to do this. So what are the comments from the panel in terms of how we permeate these ideas through our organizations?
Do you want to start with the...
Yes, well, I think that, I guess my view is, especially with the military, you're not going to be able, there is a trend now and a push now to try to make the general military forces more soft-like, the emphasis on foreign language training and so forth. And I think that you can go a certain distance down that road. But they are never going to abandon, I think, the combat missions as their primary missions and the traditional threats, and therefore the need to train for those. And so that's why I come down on the side of the specialization when possible. When you have an arena, an area of operations as large as Iraq, there is no way you can cover it with special forces alone. So you need to have some ability to expand, which is why they've been trying to do all of the training rotations out in California, really modeled on the Iraq situation. I don't know if it's as balkanized at state, or at least the people I've talked to in SCRS, they're really trying to see them set themselves up as a coordinating body so that they can reach out to the different pieces of state, INL, which has obviously the mandate for the police training piece and so forth, and also interagency, to be the interagency actor. And one can only hope that they will succeed, in my view. I mean, it's really discouraging to see their budget requests not getting through Congress, and you've got to say what's needed to try to build a better lobby on the Hill. I've attended some of the hearings, and you see on one view seems to be, well, we're taking money out of our military capability and we don't want to starve our troops. That's one point of view. And then you have other people saying, well, why create this slush fund or this hammer, this tool that is going to just get us involved in more conflicts, rather than what I think is the argument for creating and funding this robustly is we keep getting into these situations. We have no capability to handle them well. Let's, for heaven's sakes, build something that we can use rather than keep reinventing this mess.
Very quickly, this reminds me of a situation I was faced. I was sent out to do a job in Asia, and after I got there, they told me I had to fire 60% of the staff. They didn't tell me that until I got out there, and I figured the only way to do it was to enable them to do it themselves. So essentially what happened is that the staff created little cells, if you will, and they discussed among themselves as to who was best fitted for the job and so forth and so on. My point here is that if we're looking at the various communities engaged in this, the military, the NGOs, the IOs, and so forth, if you assume, for the purposes of response to your question, that each one of those communities sort of separates one little piece of itself independently of any other responsibilities, and then creates a sort of neutral venue site at which these various pieces of themselves could then begin the discussion. So you're looking at phase one of a long process which is going to enable them to find ways to dissociate themselves from their original institutions and move on to a much more sort of spider web, if you will, kind of arrangement by which they can find different ways to communicate. It's hard to change a mindset. You know, even in this room, it's hard to do. So that's one proposal.
I think just continued training is key. I mean, that's one of the reasons that UNAMA is involved in pre-deployment training for NATO troops, U.S. troops, others, because we have to continue the dialogue, institutionalized training. But like you said, it's a long process, but we just have to slug through it, I think.
Yeah, I would maybe take it another step. I think that these new offices are going to be fairly successful at spreading the ideas and the thinking and expanding that and really improving the information that people have available to them. And I think that training will also be something that will be accepted. My fear is that, and my expectation is that the bureaucracies will then start to reject the deeper reach into their pockets in particular. And while the Pentagon might find it comfortable making a $200 million transfer to SCRS, $201 million will probably be a step too far, and that then doesn't show that there really is that institutional change. And in the setting up of these offices, the degree of how robust they were going to be has been compromised at every critical decision point. Starting with the national security meeting of the principals, where they had two choices before them, presented to them by the NSC staff, and they chose the lesser. They chose the hybrid as opposed to the robust approach. And you can go down through the bureaucratic history to the money issues and how the State Department chose to go to the Hill for a supplemental of $7 million as opposed to squeezing the $7 million out of their own soul and then going to the Hill and asking for $250 million, which would have been a much smarter legislative strategy. So they've made some, I think, very troubling compromises. I'm still hopeful. It's better to have these offices than nothing. Those of you who are fans of Doug Stafford, I know there are a few here, will remember that one of his great pieces of advice is never, ever, 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 ever take a job of a coordinator. He meant it, and I know that some of you have had that title in your careers have found it to be less satisfying than you imagined. The other thing that I'd like to say, and it gets back to something that Roy said early on, and I'm not in complete agreement, but I think it's a very provocative point where he said earlier, the West is being seen as intruders who do not belong. That's a pretty strong characterization, and I think it's an important one, and certainly one we've got to be sensitive to. I think he said we're increasingly being seen as, so I would agree with that. And if we accept that, then we may be back in this situation where we're kind of learning the lessons of the last war again, because we're trying to figure out how we do what we have done traditionally better than we've done it in recent times, when in fact what we really have to be thinking about is a very different way of working in places where we have used arguments such as this one, that there is not enough absorptive capacity among the people of this place to figure out how to solve their own problem. Now, those of us who've been out there have never seen a shortage of people who were capable of solving their own problem, but they almost never had the resources to do that. But we were there, of course, to guide them through that process, and that guidance now is at risk along with other interventions, and I don't see that we're making those changes. So we're getting the offices in place as the world is actually changing, and it's going to really require much more direct assistance and direct approaches than we have, and that's very tough for organizations that are used to putting bodies on a problem, and most of us find that putting bodies on problems is one way that we solve them. So I think that's the next generation of challenges that we have, and it may in fact get us through some of these philosophical debates that we haven't resolved in this round even. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Does that sound all right to does that sound okay? We've now provoked at least 10. We have one. We can take one question. Okay. Who wants to fight for the microphone here? Just throw the microphone in the air and we'll go for it. Well, how about this gentleman right here in the middle? I think. I'm sorry. That's the one I could see best.
Thank you very much. I'm Rich Brown from State. I'd like to just ask each of you, if we do what we're doing about as well as we might, how long will this take?
Wow. Well, I'm going to just share with you a conversation I had yesterday, which was seeking some information about how much funding for SCRS they were looking at in the 08 budget they're just starting to build. And the answer was, it all depends on what we get out of Congress for 07. And of course, the picture isn't that good on that, and the amount, the $100 million last year, was zeroed out. And I think it's a serious problem. But I think that I'd throw it back and say, I think it depends on whether the Secretary of State decides that this is a key part of transformational diplomacy. It makes sense that it would be, because this is really an operational capacity and really transforming the State Department to go out into the hinterlands, change the focus. Everything that she said in the Georgetown speech is embodied in SCRS. So it seems to me that if she wants a legacy, this is where it could be built.
Can I define the we? By my definition of we, a couple of years. By the present definition of we, a decade, if we're lucky.
I think, at least for Afghanistan, the current wisdom is 15 to 20 years. And I think that if we draw down too many troops, and if we cut the budget too much, or if we don't spend it in a wise way, then we're going to have to go back in 20 or 30 years from now again.
Yeah, I think my feeling is that if we could actually focus our energies and really commit ourselves to being measured by a full-scale success in one place or in two places, and not places that we've done such a poor job of analysis going in that we don't really have a clue, and so there's too much makeup to be done. But I'm not actually as pessimistic about a place like Haiti, even though there are multiple arguments against it. But if you think of it as an island, if you think of it as 15 million people rather than as the 7 million people who live in Haiti, if you really committed it, if you got way outside the normal government way of doing things, you use people like Paul Farmer to take on the human security challenges of health issues, which we would probably not do. I think we could have a measurable success in our hemisphere, in our front door, on the toughest place on earth that the entire bureau, America's Bureau, is probably agrees with Linda on, and that would be, and if we really committed to it, then that would be the standard that a whole generation of people would be measured on, and then I think we could see something that would be really significant in the decade. But I think the next decade we could actually take on a couple of these a year, not the toughest ones that are still at war, and really have a very transformed map that would be quite significant. But I don't see that kind of emphasis. I don't see that kind of focus, and so that's what's worrisome about it as well. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Howard, for your opening this. Thank you, junior staff, for inviting us to be part of it. And thanks. Please join me in thanking what I thought was a terrific panel. If you could come back in about 12 minutes after the coffee break. Thank you.
Could you
hey, Howard.
What is the nature of the French presidency, if any, in Afghanistan?
Sure, I'll just go down here.
Yeah.
I'll be interested.
I was going to go. No, he was. He did an excellent job. Good, okay, good. I just want to make sure we're happy. So I'm leaving you on the cruise.
You're pretty good. Yeah. I remembered why I liked you so much in your role. I was very in tune with fundamental critique.
I really enjoyed your comments.
I was, the issue. I was struck by how little attention was paid to the country. It was all, we've got to get our act together. The fundamental issue was how did people see the country? Plus, these guys have ownership of the process. It's all going to make our lives difficult in every one of these cases. Process issues, not a substance issue. It's how do you relate to people? Build a relationship. How do you give them these guys? How do you get them out of these?